An original.
From Story Studio Network.
I'm Erin Trafford.
I'm Dave Trafford, and welcome to this episode of Canadian Forestry Can Save the World.
This is the podcast series where we explore the role the forestry industry can play in fighting climate change.
And in this episode, we're going to make you think differently about building with wood.
Earlier in this series, we focused on emerging and innovative technologies that amount to new thinking and new approaches to the old way of doing things.
Yeah, we tend to struggle with our definition and expectation of innovation.
Typically, we assume the latest innovations are the shiniest, scrappiest, lightning-in-a-bottle products and services driven by AI learning and all these fancy apps.
Okay, in some cases, that's true. But we've seen plenty of cases where innovation is more about new thinking, creating new culture and new economic opportunities, applying a new lens to create new solutions. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the forestry sector.
If you think about it...
In a new way.
Okay, yes. If you think about it in a new way, when forestry applies new thinking to its traditional approaches to harvesting trees and milling those logs into lumber, to using the whole log, we've seen plenty of examples of innovative uses of wood product that have made their way into everything from the dashboard of your SUV to the sidewalk in front of your house.
Yeah, and don't forget, we also heard about the new product packaging coming to a grocery store near you. This is really cool. There's work being done to manufacture a wood product, and it replaces plastic cellophane. It would effectively amount to a piece of see-through paper. A wood product not only captures carbon, but it's suitable for composting.
It's a compostable wood alternative to a petroleum-based plastic that would otherwise end up in a landfill site.
And the thing that is striking about these new products is we're using them. We're touching them every day in products we don't associate with a tree in the bush.
But one of the most impressive emerging innovative wood product technologies may actually be wood.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Cross-laminated timber. It's quickly becoming the construction material of choice for architects, designers, and engineers across Canada.
Yes, so CLT, the other phrase we hear used is mass timber.
That's right. And if you haven't heard the first season of this series, that's where we introduced mass timber on a drive-by of the newest mass timber building located on the lakeshore in Toronto.
Now, as we turn onto the westbound Gardiner Expressway, the George Brown College waterfront campus is coming up on the left. And you can see a brand new building that's under construction, expected to be finished in 2024.
Well, I mean, the view from the Gardiner is great, especially because we're in stop-and-go traffic.
Some things haven't changed.
Right, but so why is it that we're so interested in this one particular new campus building?
It's called Limberlost Place. And based on the website at George Brown, it will be the new home of the School of Architectural Studies, the School of Computer Technology, and the Brookfield Sustainability Institute. It's a community learning hub dedicated to research, innovation, and sustainability.
Sounds like a bit of a petri dish for innovation studies.
Mm-hmm. And it's all the stuff we've been sort of talking about in this podcast series. The cool thing is, all of this future thinking education now being housed in a mass timber building. It's the first net zero carbon emissions institutional project in Ontario. It's the province's tallest wooden building.
A completely wooden building? Like no concrete, no steel, no rebar, none of that?
No, not necessarily. There will be some components of the structure that, well, they need concrete and they need steel, but the primary material is wood. So mass timber is easier to use and is just as strong in some cases as concrete and steel.
No, hold on. That literally cannot be right.
No. It's not only right, it's the leading edge technology that's becoming the material of choice by architectural designers. Now, we did that drive about a year ago, and the George Brown building called Limberlost Place was obviously under construction. As we record this episode now, the building's much closer to completion, and we're told it's about a year away from opening for classes.
So still a fair amount of work to be done, but the build and design team have a hard time containing their excitement.
My name is Carol Phillips. I'm a partner at Moriyama Teshima Architects in Toronto.
I had a chance to talk to Carol Phillips. She and her team at Moriyama Teshima Architects were part of the winning bid to design and build Limberlost Place with mass timber. But it was kind of a learn-as-you-go process because the use of mass timber is in its infancy here in Ontario. Expertise was scarce, and the building regulations in Ontario really didn't address the use of mass timber.
Back in 2016, 2017, when we were first thinking of entering competitions, for instance, for mass timber buildings, in Ontario, there was no expertise. There weren't any constructed buildings here, and to even qualify for some of the competitions, including the one that we were successfully commissioned with, and the building that's under construction for George Brown College, we partnered with Acton Austria Architects out of Vancouver, and every competing team partnered with other out-of-province or even out-of-country architects, because within Ontario there was no expertise. So it's that nascent.
But British Columbia has placed a priority on the use of wooden construction materials. And with that comes a whole new set of wood use regulations, and that, in turn, has actually encouraged the use of new innovative products like mass timber.
BC has a wood first program that actually perhaps encourages innovation, use of exploration of material in these environments, and everybody's kind of on board that they have to include a certain amount of wood content in their projects. And so it's almost natural that new and emerging technologies have an uptake in those provinces. And so in my mind, it's tied to regulation. It's tied to willing clients.
So what's the balance between that innovative use of a product like mass timber and the regulation that is around it? Because they have to work hand in glove. We just can't say that's the regulation and that's as far as we're going to go. They both have to kind of organically exist, don't they?
They do. So there's a couple of different levels of regulation. There are, for instance, the regulatory bodies that say these are the targets vis-a-vis the climate emergency for your projects. So they regulate what we're able to build and the performance of those buildings. And I think the interesting balance is to start shifting the conversation to a performance-based solution in design, both on the regulatory targets for the environment and on the building code performance.
It means the technology, in this case, is shaping and informing the regulations. The building code is responding to the performance of the materials.
I want to understand what mass timber is. Like, what makes it special? What makes it innovative? I've still got questions about all the building code and regulations and stuff, but no matter how you cut it, I'm understanding this correctly, mass timber is an all-wood product.
Yes, no matter how you cut it, or no matter how you frame it, you've nailed it. A mass timber slab is still a huge piece of wood.
Oh, my word. I opened the door on that one, and you've now reached your moratorium on dad jokes.
Okay. I sense you have a burning question.
Stop, please stop. Yes, I do actually have a burning question. I can't help but think that right now we are, okay, I'm doing it again.
Playing with fire.
Yeah, okay. So tell the average person, let's just take a step back from the dad jokes here and get real for a second. If we tell the average person that we're building one of these large institutional buildings out of wood, the first thing that comes to their mind is going to be, is there an increased risk of fire?
So it's a good thing I caught up with Stephen Street.
My name's Stephen Street. I'm the Executive Director with the Woodworks Ontario program.
Among other things, he and his team at Woodworks Ontario not only promote the increased use of wood in construction projects, which makes sense given the name of the group, they're on the front lines of those regulatory discussions, particularly in this case, as they apply to mass timber.
We're now developing very, very strong materials using mass timber technology and using lightwood framing with automation, etc., and factory built. So the code has to progress along with that. And then you have to create the opportunities for the industry to start going through. And what Woodworks was created to do was to take those code provisions, illustrate the opportunities to the market, and then actually help them become a reality. So buildings like the 10-story Limberlost project at George Brown College, for example, that's a way that the code is now progressing. It's going up sort of 10 stories, 12 stories, and then whatever comes beyond that, using these new materials. And we actually help people understand that you can use wood, how it can be used, and kind of work with the codes and standards side, but also the research and development side as well.
So tell me, when you talk about sort of staying ahead of those codes, how active are you in the conversation about this is where we're going to need to go with the code because our research and development is going to land here in the next 5 years with a new product? Yeah,
that's a fascinating question. And one, the code tends to be very reactive, right? So it's kind of like, I would say like rock music, right? You've always got these people that are experimenting with music that are out at the front of the genres, and that then pulls the whole music industry through. And it's the same with the construction industry. You've got very, very early adopters and pioneers that say, this is where we're heading for the obvious reasons, one around the embodied carbon of building materials, etc. So we know we have to do better. We have to green our construction practices. And what the building code has allowed over the years is the alternative solutions stream. So this is the part of the building code that says, okay, the code right now doesn't allow you to do what you're actually wanting to do, but there is an alternative solutions path that is heavy on consultants, heavy on research and development, but it's needed because it pushes the genre forward as a construction industry. So it creates opportunities. It allows the buildings to get built, and then it says, okay, well, this building is working. It's performing exactly like we said it should. And it takes a few years for the code to actually start creeping up to meet what that building has achieved. So it brings us back to the point Carol was making about the regulations. They need to be driven by performance metrics. How does this material perform? How does the building perform when it includes that given material?
It means high-performing, innovative materials like mass timber accelerate the development of innovative regulations.
Absolutely. I think that is actually a key part of this, is to understand how we can how we can actually permit a certain flow of innovation and solutions with respect, for instance, to the housing crisis, to actually be creative in those areas without putting anyone at risk. I think there is an innovation required. I think that's a great point that you make.
And Carol directly addresses your question, by the way, about fire and how the codes not only deal with wood product, but responds to the risk of using a wood product.
So, for instance, in the code, there is a very clear line that's drawn between what shall or could be constructed out of combustible materials and what cannot. But the issue of combustibility is not necessarily the issue. The issue is, have you regulated the risk? Have you regulated the risk by having your building sprinklered? Have you regulated the risk by using proven materials? In the same way that we meet environmental standards by saying, have you sourced your material from within a certain radius of your building, et cetera, that these are criteria that you have to meet, not necessarily prescribing which material to use.
The broader question in the code addresses combustibility from a risk mitigation perspective. And that takes into account things like the performance of the material, but also some obvious regulations applying to things like sprinklers, where they're installed, how many there are in the building.
Okay, but I'm still not sure that gets my head around the idea that the primary material in a building is fuel for fire.
All right, so let's meet Brock O'Donnell.
My name is Brock O'Donnell. I'm the technical advisor for Woodworks Ontario.
He works with Stephen at Woodworks Ontario. Now, he tells us there's been a good deal of research done specifically on mass timber. The Canadian Wood Council, along with Woodworks Ontario, other groups across the country, have conducted what they're calling the largest mass timber fire demonstration. They did 5 different test burns.
Hold on a second. They actually lit an entire mass timber building on fire?
They mocked up an office space. They mocked up homes, you name it, like construction sites, and they set them on fire.
They had an open office burn. They had a couple of residentials, and then also a fire testing burn for site construction as well, too, because the construction site, sometimes that provides a little bit more of a risk. But as mass timber, it burns very predictable, which is a huge point for having timber in your building, because you can understand the char layer and how that fire is going to perform.
What's the char layer? What is that?
It's the protective sacrificial layer, I guess, for the structural part. So you're taking what you need for the actual structure and you're protecting it with that sacrificial layer. So when you are seeing the fire happen, that layer will burn, and then it will start to char. It will eat into the timber, but you're still protecting that structural layer.
The mass timber testing determined the predictability of the fire. For example, a mass timber column or a wall would have something akin to a veneer covering it. That's the wood that will burn, but not burn hot or intensely enough to ignite the mass timber.
Probably the easiest way to think about it is if you put a big log onto a fire and you see the charring, right, that starts to come up, the charcoal that comes on the edge. That's really the sort of science behind how mass timber behaves in a fire. So the char, which forms on the outer edges of the mass timber elements, will actually insulate the wood inside. So it's like putting a fire. You've got a campfire going, you put a big log on it, and 9 out of 10 times the fire extinguishes itself because there's not enough fuel to go. And that's the same kind of thing with mass timber.
Okay, hold up. Let me understand this correctly. The innovation here is not simply just the use of the wood product itself, which it is pretty cool. But if I'm hearing all of this right, it's also the testing showing that mass timber slows down the fire.
That's right. Yeah, the engineering of the mass timber helps prevent the spread and the increased intensity of the fire.
And that performance is contributing to the evolution of all these other things, like the building codes and the regulations that in turn make our infrastructure, all stages of construction, really safer and more resilient to fire. Okay, super glad we dealt with that fire question, because I can see how that concern might actually get in the way of us all using mass timber in buildings and housing developments and commercial developments. So let's get to actually how it works, why it works, and the benefits beyond these safety standards.
All right, so let's start with some basics. Let's go back to last season again. We met Sindhu Mahadevan.
My name is Sindhu Mahadevan. I am a senior associate and head of R&D at Michael Green Architecture.
Sindhu is a Vancouver-based architect and a major user and proponent of mass timber. Now, as she explains it, mass timber is essentially an highly engineered wood product.
Where we take pieces of wood, small pieces of wood, anything from dimensional lumber to wood strands, and we glue it together and we refine it and calibrate it in a very specific engineered way.
As the name would suggest, cross-laminated timber is made up of different layers of wood.
And cross-laminated timber is only one mass timber product. There's also a product called glue-laminated timber. They're each specifically engineered to meet a really particular design or construction objective.
Just recently, there was another product that came out called mass ply panel. But again, it's kind of approaches in a slightly different way to achieve kind of a different kind of strength.
And depending on the process and the need, mass timber can be engineered to use as support material in large buildings.
To create a strong and durable material that's similar to the strength of steel and concrete.
The strength of mass timber can be similar to poured concrete or steel beams.
Yeah, I remember Nick Milestone at Mercer Mass Timber talking about the benefits of using mass timber over things like concrete and steel.
I'm the Director of Sales, Marketing and Project Execution for Mercer Mass Timber, which is a wholly owned subsidiary of Mercer International.
But more importantly, mass timber is being used effectively in combination with various building solutions.
You know, to build with pure mass timber structures up to 18 stories, we're now starting to see mass timber structures go up to 20, 21, 22 stories, but maybe on a structural steel frame. It's certainly getting its way into the residential sector. It's sort of substituting the floor construction on light timber floors. And then it's even finding its way, believe it or not, into another evolution of technology of light gauge steel framed wall solutions with CLT floors. It's kind of really getting into all applications and all building typologies, be it, as I say, office, residential, warehousing, any form of construction now. A lot of stakeholders, like the Meta companies in California and throughout the US, a lot of architects are now looking at how they can somehow get mass timber into the equation.
As I recall, Nick's work in mass timber started in Europe well before seeing it here in North America.
Yeah, that's true. Kind of reminds me of the conversation we had about district heating. I mean, that started in Europe decades ago, and we're only really now beginning to consider similar projects here in Canada. Mass timber seemed to follow a similar timeline. You heard Carol Phillips say there were virtually no mass timber regulations here in Ontario back in 2016, not so long ago. And the design and the expertise when it came to developing mass timber buildings was pretty scarce. As seems to be the case when it comes to a lot of innovation around the use of wood, British Columbia seems to be among the early adopters in this country. And mass timber use is a good example of that. I had a chance to talk to Tim Caldecott.
Tim Caldecott with FP Innovations. I am the Senior Director of Sustainable Construction, Carbon and Market Economics.
Sustainable construction is included in his portfolio at FP Innovations in BC. And as we noted, mass timber has a proven history already in Europe. So I asked him when it became widely used in Canada and what took so long.
In Canada, that would have been right around 2010. And it was, I think you're right. It's been a product in Europe since the 80s. It sort of gathered steam, I'd say, late 90s, early 2000s. And then really sort of that 2010 is when it really started to take off as like, wow, this could be really something interesting and significant.
Why is the lag there? I mean, we live in similar climates to the Nordic countries in Europe. We seem to be, there's a good, as you described it, maybe 30 years behind the curve on that.
It's a fair question. But, you know, I mean, material adoption curves are much longer than you would expect. You know, you think of a product you're using today and think how great it is, and it probably took 15 or 20 years to get to the point where it is commonly accepted and utilized. So I'd say it's not abnormal, but it does sound like a long time. And the thing you find with developers and builders is, you know, we've been building with, say, stick frame houses for a long time. People understand it. They're comfortable with it. With concrete, with steel for a long time. And a building should be there for many decades. And so kind of working with a new material, it does create some trepidation at the start, because I don't know how to use this. I'm more familiar with this other thing. And I would say, you know, the building sector is I wouldn't call them rapid adopters of new systems. How about that?
How do you break through that?
Yeah, well, and I think, you know, the beauty of almost any market is you've got a few folks they want to be early adopters, right? And architects, designers are really great about pushing the envelope in that respect. And then you've got some builders that say, I think there's an opportunity here, and they give it a shot. And so, you know, even we've had a few famous projects here in Vancouver where there was a lot of trepidation at the start. let's say, a multi-phase process or project. And building number one was working out a lot of the difficulties in adopting a new material. And by the second or third building, they're saying, this is fantastic. Like, I can go fast. I found all these efficiencies that I wouldn't have considered had I not taken on the project in the first place. And so there gets to be quite some excitement. Like even the Brock Commons building, which is quite, I guess, famous. It's 18 stories at GBC. It started as sort of a floor a week. And by the end, they were doing 3 floors a week. Right, just on the same project, just by like floors 10 through 18 is when they really started to take off and get the rhythm going. So it's pretty, I guess, encouraging, cool.
As we build more with mass timber, and you're learning new things as you do that, what's the curve? What is there anything in there that's you've seen over the last 5 years that sort of, we didn't see that actually as a benefit, but here it is?
I think that speed of construction, it's something that is new to every new developer or every new construction company that hasn't done it before. So I think that speed is one of them. I think the other thing that I've heard from architects anyway is with a new material, you sort of end up replicating what exists already. So can I take a concrete wall and make a CLT wall, for example, or mass timber wall? And then it takes, again, a few years for them to say, wait a minute, maybe I could make that wall differently or curved or do something that I couldn't do with concrete. And I think that's the phase you're sort of entering in right now is, hey, we could do this differently, or we could make, for example, there's another building in Vancouver where it's called the balloon wall, where you can basically tilt up the entire wall section at one time, which is something, that's just sort of emerging of like, well, that'd be interesting because now I can put up the big structure and then drop the floor plates in at different times versus platform, where I build a story and then I build the next story.
Just so I understand, you're talking about building the outside frame of the walls and then actually dropping the floors inside that box.
Right, roughly speaking.
Cool.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. Sort of unleashes these new ideas of okay, what can we do with this material that I couldn't do with these other materials? And I think that's the phase we're in Canada right now. Is sort of an exciting time for designers, architects, and even builders, right, to see what can we do differently with this material.
What can we do differently with this material? Tim has made our point. Yes, innovation can be about new products, new services, new delivery systems, but we're hearing more and more the innovation is in the thinking, new approaches to the old way of doing things. And in the case of mass timber, the performance of the product encourages and inspires that new thinking.
New thinking leading directly to new possibilities, new opportunities. As Tim explained, the mass timber building they constructed on the UBC campus went up faster than a conventional construction project. They needed fewer workers on site to do the assembly. Carol Phillips observed the very same thing at George Brown when it was being constructed in Toronto.
It takes like 10 minutes for a panel to come from the ground and be placed in place. And, these are panels that are 7 meters by 3 meters. So you look at that square footage and you think it's 10 minutes. It's significant and it is fast.
So essentially, it's faster, safer for workers overall, and less time for crews and trucks to be idling on a construction site.
And most of that translates into cost savings.
The fact that it's prefabrication, so more control. The fact that it is accurate. The fact that it's faster. One of the things I think is pretty interesting, it takes up less space because you can do just-in-time delivery. If you know you're putting up a floor this week, the trucks can arrive in sequence and then move away. They don't have to sit on the site for hours and hours or days and days, churning out the actual material on site, for instance, the way you would do with concrete.
So let me just spitball here for a minute, because we've talked a lot about the use of mass timber in larger institutional buildings, like Limberlost Place. Mass timber and the new, more efficient construction techniques that come with it, though, could be a game changer in tackling our housing crisis.
Well, that's a good point. I mean, we know, for example, 1 in 5 Canadians currently are unable to find affordable housing. We also know we're going to need about 6 million new housing units by 2030 just to meet the demand.
Sure sounds like using mass timber could help to accelerate the all hands on deck housing building boom.
We hear the term about, a wartime effort, and I think that's exactly what it's going to take.
We know the guys at Woodworks Ontario are looking toward the day when mass timber is widely used to build new homes.
We need to get out of our own little boxes, and we actually have to say, hey, listen, we're in the construction industry. We have a responsibility to do things better, to faster. We have to build, embracing some of these new technologies and these new ways forward. And it's time for us to do it. And everyone's going to benefit.
I can't help but think of the comment that Sindhu Mahadevan made in our last season. She not only sees more mass timber being used in future projects like housing, she's somewhat circumspect, if not even poetic in her view.
I do think there's a lot more that we can do, we can learn, and we can continue to invent just with wood, keeping in mind that nature holds the patent and we're just lucky to be able to explore it.
Using more wood is good for business. It's good for the planet. But as she says, keeping in mind nature holds the patent, and we're just lucky to be able to explore it.
I love that. Nature holds the patent. What a great new way to think of it.
Also a great thought to leave us on. We've got plenty to talk about, including the advanced technologies like the Internet of the Forest. You're going to hear a lot about that.
And also more on how this battle against climate change means taking stock of our relationship with our forests, our environment, and the planet.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Canadian Forestry Can Save the World. If you're listening on Apple, leave us a rating and a comment. Maybe you've got a question, so pass that along as well. For our producer, Becky Coles, our technical producer and audio editor, Mike Trutler, for Aaron and the whole team at Story Studio Network, thanks for listening.
This podcast series is produced for Forestry for the Future.
And for more information, I'd encourage you to visit the website forestryforthefuture.ca. And you may want to get involved in supporting a sector that's committed to growing a greener economy and driving our country towards a net zero carbon future for you and your kids. I'm Dave Trafford, and Canadian Forestry Can Save the World is produced by Story Studio Network.
This
is SSN.